What you don't know is I got my flip-flops on and I've got my shorts on, but I do have a shirt and tie, but my shirt's not tucked, but you can't tell that either. So this is cool. Okay, so let's talk about trauma. Trauma is significant, especially chest trauma. That's what we're going to talk about is chest trauma. It's significant in that 10% of all admissions into ER are chest trauma related, and 12 in 1 million admissions of our chest trauma per day. So that means like here on the Wasatch Front, we have about 1 million people on the Wasatch Front. I kind of counted them up, we got about 18 or 19 hospitals on the Wasatch Front, counting Ogden to Provo, Payson. But therefore, 12 admissions into those 18 hospitals would be chest trauma every day. So yeah, chest trauma is a significant factor in it. So that means 12 transports a day would be chest trauma related. 25% of all trauma deaths are chest trauma deaths. And another 25% are chest trauma related factors that contributed to their death. So that means that 50% of all trauma deaths are chest trauma related, either directly or indirectly. So chest trauma is significant, and that's why we need to take it serious. Since the chest is so important to our life, it's a good idea to take a look at the musculoskeletal system. First of all, we've got a very robust muscular system protecting the body with quite a bit of muscle, both front and back. We can see the muscle system there, making this a very robust system for protecting. However, when we do get enough trauma impact, we can see fractured ribs, and they can become a real difficult problem. This is just a picture of the alveoli and the trachea and the bronchioles and the upper respiratory airway. We'll be talking more about that as we get into the presentation, but this is just a picture for representation so that you'll get a feel for it. I know you've seen it before. The chest also contains the heart and the greater vessels, and it's a very covered with lots of capillaries as well for the oxygen and air exchange that goes on in it. And then as we look at the back behind there, we have the epiglottis, the trachea, and the greater vessels of the heart that are all potential for injury as well as very vital to our survival. Torn aortas, ruptured esophagus, trachea, all of that can be bad. And then we've got the heart in the center of it all, and we know how important that is. We can, it has its own sac, and when that sac gets ruptured or injured, we can get fluid inside that sac that can cause the heart not to be able to beat appropriately. We call that distributive shock. It's one of the shocks that we don't talk about very much because it is very specific to the cardiac tamponade scenario. So that's pretty much what we've got as we look a little bit more in depth at trauma of the heart. Okay, so now that you've got a little bit of understanding of, well, you've got a lot of understanding of the anatomy, physiology of the chest, and more specifically the breathing processes. We're going to now go into a little bit more about the specifics of trauma-related injuries. So first of all, we have our trachea, and it's divided out into two bronchi, And then they are divided off into smaller bronchi. The left side has 2 lobes, so there's 2. On the right side we have 3 stems. So this is the bronchial tubes. They also branch out into smaller and smaller bronchioles and down into the alveoli. And then we have our lungs. Something like that. And then we have ribs. How many ribs do we have? Well, we have 12, right? But some of those ribs are, in fact 2 of them, are in the back, and they're what we would call floating ribs because they don't really connect to the sternum. So we have our ribs. And then, to make it more complete, the ribs have intercostal muscles. These intercostal muscles, actually there's 2 sets of them. We have the exterior intercostal muscles that connect all of the ribs together. And then we have the internal. And anybody like ribs? Those spare ribs? Well, the really good meat on those spare ribs is this intercostal muscles. Good tender. So we have our ribs and our intercostals, and that is part of the process that helps us breathe. Then we also have our diaphragm that basically connects, is a dome-shaped muscle that is, we all know how that works. As we inhale, the diaphragm goes down, causing a negative pressure inside the lungs, and the lungs therefore expand, and the outside air pressure rushes in to fill that negative pressure state. So I have my little example here. This is a poor example, but an example of how that negative space works. So this is got a hole in the top that allows the air into the trachea, into the lungs. These are the lungs hanging down here in this glove. And then I'm just going to suck on the straw to cause a negative pressure in here. And that's basically how the lungs work. Negative pressure in the chest cavity causes the lungs to expand, and therefore air comes into and fills out that space. Now, this is not very elastic like the chest wall is, and so we're not going to see it move with it. But the alveoli are these little balloon-like grape things. This is my alveoli, only it looks more like a hand, I'm sure. But as the air goes in, sucks in, the alveoli inflate, and they're covered with capillaries, and we get this gas exchange between the alveoli and the bloodstream stream, and so we get the carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange taking place in the lungs. And so that's how that does work. But we also have, to make this really work, we do have a membrane, a viscous membrane that basically connected to the chest wall, and it is physically connected to the chest wall, and it is also connected to the diaphragm, and to the chest wall again. And it comes up and actually is sealed into the system at the neck. And so we have the pleural membrane and the visceral membrane. So this is the pleural membrane. And it is, like I say, it is physically connected to the chest wall. Well, then the lungs also have a membrane around them that is physically connected to the lung. So this membrane goes all the way around the lungs, and so these two membranes meet. And actually, contrary to this is showing this space, but it is really called a potential space because there is no real space here. This is just the space they're actually touching. Probably a good example would be this is my pleural membrane, and this is my visceral membrane, and they are right here. This is the lung, and so the lung is connected directly to this membrane, and when this membrane goes out, the lung goes out, and the lung goes out with it. And when the ribs come back in, or the diaphragm relaxes back up, then it comes back in like this. This is not a really good representation because we're not seeing the viscous fluid that should be between here that allows them to attract. So let's add some viscous fluid here. Now, when we put these two together, now when this one goes out, so does the visceral. So when this membrane goes out, this one goes with it because of this viscous fluid in between the two membranes, and therefore this is not a real space, it's a potential space. We don't want there to be a space in there. We want the lungs to move with the chest wall and with the diaphragm, and so this is our process that we're going to get to cause breathing to take place. Now this fluid, it allows these membranes to move, because as the lung expands, obviously there's going to be some movement of the fluid between them, and that's okay. That's what we want it to have happen. So that is the principle of breathing. We inhale, we exhale, and our diaphragm goes down, our chest walls goes up, And so our problem can come, though, when this, because there's not supposed to be air between here. When air gets between here, then all of a sudden we get this lack of continuity, and the lung is not going to follow through. And so this can happen in several different ways. A penetrating injury can cause for example, a knife, a wound, a stick, a spear, whatever, penetrates through the chest wall and no, I'm outside, and so you'll hear outside noises. And the camera only recorded for not all of it, so you see a more complete drawing than what we left. So, but what we're still having is, because of this injury into the chest wall, we actually have the lung collapsing because air is escaped and allowed into this area, and therefore the lack of membrane connection allows the lung to collapse and allows the chest cavity to fill up with air. This is called a pneumothorax, obviously. And the ways that we would be able to detect this is, first of all, auscultation. Well, first of all would be mechanism of injury. We'd recognize that there was a mechanism of injury, this penetrating wound or blunt trauma that could cause a tear in the lung lining and allow this air to get into this potential space that now has become a real space and allow the lung to collapse. So that would be our first thing, is mechanism of injury. The next one would be to observe. We would expose the chest so that we can see that this side is rising better than this side on inspiration. We could also auscultate. We would listen, 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 listen. We wouldn't hear much of the breath sounds on this side. Another thing that we can do is we can percuss. Put our finger between the rib space and tap. Between the rib space, tap. Between the rib space, tap. Over here between the rib space, tap. Between the rib space, tap. And what we would notice is that this side would sound more full. This side would sound very hollow, hypotonic sounds over here, whereas over here, because of the lung tissue and all of the stuff that's filling the space, obviously if we do this over the liver, we get a really thud sound because the liver is very solid, and this would be more like a drum, but this side would sound like a big kettle drum because of the lack of stuff underneath the intercostal spaces that we're tapping on. So percussion would be another way of determining this. But most importantly, we've got our mechanism of injury, exposing front and back. We need to check the back. Maybe this was a gunshot shot in the back that didn't pass all the way through. Maybe it's a shot from the front that did pass all the way through, and so we've got two holes to patch. But we need to be aware of this because, again, these are the people that die because the hospital wasn't there to see the mechanism of injury. They don't know that the potential is here. Okay, so here's my anti-chest. CPR mannequin, okay, chest. And here is a bullet wound, and it is a sucking chest wound. We see bubbling, we see, we actually can even hear an air escaping there. So what we want to do is we would first obviously cover it with a dressing. So we would cover it with a dressing first, just to control the bleeding, and then find something. This is a sandwich bag, and we would put that over the top of this wound as well. Need my trauma shears, but I would tape this bread sack or sandwich bag down on one side, on the second side, and then on the third side. Making sure now this will act as a flutter valve as the pressure goes in, as they inhale, causing negative pressure. This bag would suck down over the hole and therefore not let air into the hole. As positive pressure, as they exhale, positive pressure would allow air to come out this and out through the flutter valve at the bottom. So a really bad presentation, but like I say, it's much easier when they're laying down, much easier when you've got more hands to do it with. But that's roughly how you do it. Of course, this would be inside there over the wound itself. But that's the process that we use to seal this wound.